Good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing? Good, good. Love it. All right, well, my name is Kelly. I will be your session host today, and I get the pleasure of introducing Chad. Today, he is going to walk us through untangling Christmas lights, tips and tricks for managing a hand-me-down Jamf deployment, hence the music, the intro music today. But Chad Lawson is a geek, his words, not ours. He has been in the IT industry for 30 years, including working at Apple as a build engineer in the early days of Mac OS from 10.0 to 10.2. He has been a Jamf integrator for over 10 years and worked with over 200 organizations to succeed with Jamf. In 2021, Chad launched a nonprofit company, Maker Spaceship, to promote a maker mindset to young people. So I'm very excited to introduce him and to have him get started. Everyone join me in welcoming Chad to the stage.
Good afternoon. Everybody's still here and awake after lunch. This is great. There's a story, as I was putting this together, that I really like. A person is walking down a street and they fall into a hole. And this hole is deep enough and the walls are slick enough that they can't climb out by themselves. And after a while, they see a doctor walk by and they're like, "Doctor, can you please help me? I'm stuck in this hole." The doctor writes a prescription, tosses in the hole, and moves on. A little while later, they see a priest walk by and they say, "Father, I'm stuck in this hole. Can you please help me out?" Priest writes down a prayer, tosses in the hole, and moves along. Eventually, a friend walks by and the person says, "Joe, can you help me? I'm stuck down in this hole and I can't get out." And Joe jumps into the hole. "What, are you crazy? Now we're both in the hole." "Yeah, but I've been down here before and I know the way out." I love that story, and it's very appropriate to this particular situation of so many of us have been in this situation, and so many of us are going to be in this situation, that it's important that we continue this sharing and communication in the spirit of JNUC. I am, as mentioned, Chad Lawson. I am a Jamf engineer with Rocketman Tech. Today I'm going to talk about a little bit of the road that I traveled and how I ended up falling in a hole. And you can see I'm mixing metaphors. I loved the whole story. I didn't want to give it up, but I started with Christmas tree lights, so I'm all over the place. But about getting untangled, provide some pearls of wisdom, hard-earned pearls of wisdom, and then I have one little bonus that some of you will find amazing and some of you will wonder what's wrong with me. Yeah, I'm not kidding. So the road I traveled, a little bit of the history of this. Talking about I have very severe ADHD, so every story comes with 6 stories for context. So let's see how well I can do this. But starting in 2009, I was working with a Apple Consultants Network member, and my very first client was a school using Jamf. And here was somebody, one person, one Jamf administrator, managing multiple schools, hundreds of devices, all because he had Jamf at his disposal. And he really said, "You need to get trained on this." And then suddenly we had more clients that were using Jamf, and it became very important that somebody knew what they were doing. In 2010, I was lucky enough to be sent to Boston in February. And I took my first what was then called CCA, now 200 class. Fast forward to 2012, the organization I was working with, we became a Jamf integrator so that we could perform, well, now called Jamf Partner. And between 2015 and roughly 2020, when everything kind of changed, I've performed roughly 150 jump starts in person and remote, the majority of them being in person. Yeah, they used to be called jump starts, now they're called onboardings. I forgot I was supposed to change that term. But one of those, I was traveling all over a 300-mile radius of Milwaukee, my home. So I would work with clients in one city one day, travel to the next. But every once in a while I get lucky, like in 2017, and there'd be a company right in my own hometown. So I met the company. I'm sure they wouldn't mind my saying who they are, but since I did not get written permission before this, I will simply be calling them the company. But I went and did a 3-day jump start. onboarding class, and my client, my direct person I was working with, we'll call him Michael, because that's his name. Michael and I had a great time. We were coming up with all sorts of different solutions for problems he hadn't even thought of. We were tinkering and playing. He was just so incredibly excited. He'd already been to JNUC before this and seen the IBM at Work presentation and wanted to be able to bring that kind of magic to his organization. So we came up with a bunch of great pieces, but after 3 days, it was over. But it didn't completely end there because Michael and I remained friends. And over time, he would ask me to come in and consult with him. And there were times during the whole process where it was just every once in a while. There were times where it was much more frequently. There was, let's say, a period of time where nothing was happening. And then for a number of years, it was fairly consistent consulting work. Now during this, and then roughly 22, I started working full-time with Rocket Man, and it was a bit of a conflict for me to continue doing the consulting work, so we parted ways. He said, I've got this, you set me up perfectly for success, everything's going to be fine. But then fast forward to, I forgot I had that slide built in, to 2023, where he realizes things are not perfectly fine. I could use some additional help, and he asks if he can hire me. I wasn't in a particular hurry to leave, but there were particular family reasons why it became necessary for me to go ahead and take up the opportunity. And it was great to be working with a friend again. But right off the bat, I realized things were not, well, if you've ever left a system alone for a couple of years, things start to fall apart. Now, and that's not to say that I wasn't the only person that had been maintaining this system. Through the entire time, from day one on, Michael had been in that system. But the problem is, Jamf wasn't the only thing Michael did. In fact, IT wasn't the only thing Michael did. Michael was the only IT person for most of those years. But he also handled all of the networking, all of the security, building out of infrastructure. There was literally and figuratively wore multiple hats within that company. So he did not have the full-time dedication to that system. And I love the fact that I'm seeing heads nod. And over time, they would occasionally give him an intern or somebody else that could help out. And for a brief period of time, he had an employee that would be in there, and one of their responsibilities was also helping out with Jamf. But that meant there were a lot of different people with a lot of their fingers in the same system. So when I got my hands on it, I realized a very unfortunate truth. You've probably seen a slide or a pie chart like this. Whenever you think about any particular problem, there's what you know you don't know, and what you don't know you don't know. And in this particular case, what I knew was that in the year that I'd been away since I'd last consulted with him, Jamf had wisely changed from basic authentication to token authentication. Basic auth was now turned off. And a number of my scripts that I'd written over the years were still using basic auth. So I knew that was going to need to change. I also knew, just as a function of every organization ever was going to have multiple operating systems that we were going to need to get up to date and organized. So the very first day, I sat down and pulled a CSV file of every single computer in Jamf. The numbers were a little surprising. I mean, I knew we were going to have some spread, but the fact is there were still 6 machines running operating systems before 10.15. Granted, they were Mac Minis running server instances, remember OS X server, but I was surprised at the sheer number of machines still running Catalina. And this is, as you can tell by the date on this, since this is 2023, this is before Ventura came out. So not only did I need to get everybody up to date at least to Sonoma, but I needed to get ready because Ventura was coming right down the road. As far as what I knew that I didn't know, I knew that there were machines that weren't actively in use. They were machines still in Jamf, but weren't actually being used, because we had almost 500 computers in Jamf and about 300 employees. That's a lot of computers that I don't know what they're doing. I also knew that we had a broad range of the age of the hardware. So some problems could probably be fixed by updating hardware, but I needed to know what first. I also knew that there was going to be cruft in the system, those things that just get sitting around that haven't been updated, but I didn't know how much, and I knew that was going to take some time. And I also knew that there were, as mentioned already, broken scripts and policies. I just didn't know how bad it was going to be. So looking at the loss sheet, that same spreadsheet I pulled down, I said, all right, let's take a look at last check-in. Show me convince numbers that this is actually a date and not a string, and then say, fine, now show me every computer based on when they last check in. So I have same day, meaning within the last 24 hours they've checked in. Those are really good numbers. I was really pleased with that. Within the last week, okay, people on vacation, whatever. Last month, still reasonable, a little concerned, but what bothered me was the 116 that had not checked in 30, 60, and it was almost a cutoff. Once you get to 30, it immediately jumped to close to 100 days for the last check-in. I knew something was wrong. And when it came to looking, same spreadsheet, looking at the age of hardware, okay, pretty decent spread. I'm kind of surprised some of those machines from 2012 are still in the system, but you know what? I'm sure those are the lost sheep. So what if I were to then ask that not just all of those computers, but only the ones that have been checked in within the last 30 days? Those numbers didn't change like I wanted. Suddenly I'm seeing huge groups of computers that are very new computers that haven't checked in 30 days. And I was really concerned about what was happening. As it turns out, the team, because when I was brought in, it was also in the process of bringing in a lot more IT people. And a lot of the IT people were now just grabbing computers out of the brand new boxes to do testing and then leaving them on their desks when they were done with it. So I needed to now figure out which computers were actively being used and which ones I could reclaim and get ready for the next wave of fixing everything going wrong. But the hardest part was facing, there was a large chunk of what I didn't know. Over the years, Jamf has changed so much since 2017, hasn't it? And so has Apple. So we went from the early days when I first did that recon, or that, got away from me there. When I first did that Jumpstart, the #1 way we enrolled computers was with Jamf Recon, Casper Recon, I believe it was then. And we used a quick add package. And that was still some of the documented procedure. So when the other IT people were enrolling computers, they were setting up computers manually and then manually enrolling the computers. But we already had procedures in place for automated device enrollment for the machines coming in through Apple Business Manager. So over the year, we had so many of these computers were actually still being used that they had just been following the same procedure that they were originally brought in with. So we had this huge fluctuation of some computers were brought in through ADE, and so there are different levels of supervision, different levels of control, whether or not the IT admin account was brought in as the management account or whether it was brought in through pre-stage, huge changes in how these machines were being deployed. And that created problems with admin accounts. I should also bring up, I had created a script to provide temporary admin access that would then bring it back. And it worked great for a long time, but when you leave it through 2 changes in operating systems, it stopped working as beautifully. So it would promote people and then not demote them. So now we had people that weren't supposed to have admin rights in the first place that had been given temporary admin rights, and they'd kept it. So I also needed not only to deal with the technical problems, but deal with explaining to people we were about to take away your admin rights. But it also led to problems with volume ownership. So even as I'm getting ready to refresh machines, my account, my IT admin account, is not the volume owner. The last 2 were the ones that I do want to say policies. I don't know how many of you have done this or have seen this. I have a particular pet peeve whenever I work with a client that every policy should either be scoped to some sort of group or some easy batch of computers. The fact that you can scope things to individual computers terrifies me, because then you wind up in the situation that I did, where computers were, all these policies have been scoped to individual computers, and then at some point unscoped from it to scope somebody else into it. So I knew who had what. I didn't know who should have what and why. So everything had to be moved to static groups, smart groups, buildings, and departments. But the last two were my biggest challenges. I had created an onboarding workflow, and I will show some screens in a second, to bring all the computers into place. But somewhere on the, well, actually, I'll just bring up the slides as I get the two big ones were, if you've ever, I don't think Richard's in the room. No. Richard Purvis, AKA Franton, on the Mac admin Slack, had a number of years ago created a onboarding script. In fact, he had created just a few months before I deployed it at the company. Amazing tool. But the key, because I know you can't read that, the key is that somewhere around line 20, it disables the Jamf recurring check-in. And somewhere around line 200 and something, it re-enables the recurring check-in. But that leaves me with almost 200 lines of code that multiple admins have gone in and hacked and rehacked and changed and added, and they don't know what's going on at the beginning or at the end. They're just putting the stuff they need in the middle. But if any one of those fails with a non-zero status, the recurring check-in is never re-added. So in also looking through that CSV, I found a ridiculous number of computers that their last check-in was identical to their last inventory update. And because I had put in an extension attribute for last reboot, I also happen to know that it was the exact same time as their last reboot. So that meant that the recurring check-in completely failed on those machines, and I targeted those machines to either through startup check-ins, login check-ins, or network state change, go ahead and re-enable the recurring check-in. But the part that really made my blood run cold was realizing that there were machines that weren't taking any remote management commands, and they weren't taking any configuration profiles. But these are newer machines, and I couldn't figure out why. They're only like a year and a half, 2 years old. They should be fine. So I created an extension attribute to pull their MDM topic. And I just have up here what the last three characters, that became my distinguishing thing. At the last three hexadecimal letters, the 212s represent the people that had the working MDM topic. My favorite, the DEDs, the deadheads, were the ones that had an old topic and were no longer responding. Because what turns out happened, and I'm waiting, luckily the lights are bright enough, I don't know if I can see anybody visually cringe, but what happens when your MDM or your APNS certificate expires? Things go wrong. Okay, fine. You fix it by getting a new, and there's a buffer in there that if you get a new APNS certificate, things can be okay. But if you renew it with a different Apple ID, you get a different MDM topic, and now the computers don't trust Jamf and Apple for MDM. So I now know that I had roughly 21% of my fleet, 21% of 500 computers, that the only way I was going to be able to fix them, or I'm sorry, 31% for the deadheads. The only way I was going to be able to fix them, because they all had make MDM profile non-removable. The only way I could fix this was by getting my hands on wiping them, and they are spread out across the country. So the process of getting untangled consisted of multiple parts. First of all, no, I'm not going to make a joke about the amount of coffee I drank. I think you can imagine. But first I was going to need to clean up all the cruft, narrow the OS gap, get rid of, I needed to find a way to stop making the local accounts the main point of authentication. That was easy. Jamf Connect, done. Figure out a way to gather and identify all those lost sheep, all those computers that had gone missing, but I could see boxes of machines around my cubicle that had no longer been in use, and none of them were the trouble computers. And then I also needed to come up with a workflow to rapidly be able to get machines back up and on their feet so I could get them back into the hands of people, whether they were deadheads or not. The first thing I did in terms of cruft, I'm going to bring up a slide in a moment that shows you the tools that I used for a lot of this. But the first one I used was when I got overly clever and decided to write a shell script I call policy map. And its entire job was to get me a quick view of all the policies and figure out what's going on. I love Jamf and I love the interface. Chris loves to joke that if I could spend the entire time using the API, I would, and he's right. Because going through and trying to look at all of the policies, even on the widest screen I had, clicking on the little chevrons to see what each policy was doing, and trying to retain that in my ADHD brain was proving to be a nightmare. I needed a view. So I came up with a script, yes, I know that's unreadable, that creates a CSV that gives me several pieces of information for each and every single policy. What's its Jamf ID? Is it enabled or not? What's its name? And this is not from real data, this is from our demo system now, because I didn't want to, again, bring up data I didn't have permission for. What category is it? The worst slide I could have made, that says each of those first checkboxes say like, trigger recurring check-in, trigger login, trigger, and all you can see is trigger, trigger, trigger. But each of those checkboxes determine what trigger is causing it, including then, if it's a manual trigger, what trigger causes that? And then what frequency? The next three sections include, because I was really only concerned, Jamf policies can do a ton. There's so many different options of what you can put into a Jamf policy. But all I cared about was what packages are they deploying, what scripts are they running, and at the end of all of that, are they updating inventory, running a recon? And then I needed to get my hands on the scope. Either individual computers, as I mentioned, there were plenty of them, groups, buildings, departments, etc. And then, because scope is so incredibly elaborate, I also realized simply targets wasn't enough. There were plenty that were scoped to all computers, but then had limitations, so I needed to also include my limitations and exclusions. So this was my one vanity project, writing a script that would allow me to get a look at everything within the policy. For everything else, I decided to involve some of the better, smarter brains than me. I love the phrase, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. So I decided to find smarter rooms. All of these will be in my resources, but yes, feel free to go ahead and grab a screenshot of this. The big one in terms of the imaging process, if nobody has encountered this, because I haven't seen a lot of write-ups on this, for Apple Silicon machines, there is DFU mode. Good, I'm seeing a couple head nods, so I wasn't the, you hook a computer, it's on all laptops, it's the one closest to the power port. On almost all of the computers, it's the same way. Run a cable from one computer to that port on the target computer. You can either manually put it into DFU mode, and Apple has instructions that are nearly impossible to figure out. You have to. I love video games. We just did a thing at Up Down last night. I love video games, but I do not have the hand-eye coordination to get DFU mode to work consistently. But I found a tool that you simply push a button, slams that computer into DFU mode. And then I was able to use Configurator's command line tool along with Mist to get the latest instance. You can actually download the firmware version of things, and I could bit blast a machine in about 10 minutes right back to factory reset. Not having to do erase and install, reset all contents and solutions, go through recovery mode, DFU mode, bit blast, done. Combined with Jamf Connect, as soon as the computer comes back up, it enrolls itself, goes through Setup Assistant, plugged into a computer. Within 5 minutes, that machine is already set and ready to go for the next person. Shut it down, put it into the rack. If you find yourself in the hole, I want to give you some hard-earned pearls of wisdom that I've gone through. Step one, as I've been telling myself standing here, breathe. This is not going to be solved overnight. This is not going to be solved in a week. Presumably, the people that brought you in because they know you can get this done. Trust yourself, trust your team, take a moment and get your wits about you. You've heard me say a couple of times, so I wrote a script. Don't do that. Don't do that. If you have a tool like the ones I just showed you, prioritize proven solutions, things that are maintained and developed by smarter people than you, because you have other things to do other than maintain a script. And I know there are people looking at me and absolutely amazed that I just said that out loud. But also take a moment and chronicle what you find. Document everything, because you're not going to remember 6 weeks from now, 6 months from now, what was happening. Or if you do manage to delete something, then somebody says, hey, what about this? You're not going to be able to find it again. Document everything. I have the one note in here, dear future me. In my house, my wife and I, we love to cook, obviously. We love to cook, and we love cooking together. And we have this an app for keeping track of our recipes. And whenever we try out a recipe, if we find something we didn't know, some technique we didn't know, we put a note in, dear future Chad and Ruth, use the deep pan. Or we already changed this to go from pre-sliced whatever. We put that in there, love Chad and Ruth of December 23. So the next time we come along, we can find that and say, and learn from our own past experience. Keep a document of everything. And then it's a matter of lather, rinse, repeat. I mentioned that one of the biggest challenges I had was not that things didn't work, it's that they did work and had been trusted and left alone, assuming they worked for far too long. So get into a habit, get your system up and running the way you want it, trust that it's working, but verify. Come back every once in a while, especially when it comes time for new version of Jamf comes out. Take a look at what's in the release notes. Is that going to infect anything now? If something in the release note says we're going to deprecate XYZ in the future, make sure all of your stuff can survive that. And every time you see an Apple release, because those are the ones that'll get you, make sure you're ready for that. And if you haven't already gotten into this habit, as soon as a new OS is coming out, test everything you have on the new OS before it rolls out. And in some cases, if you just can't get everything fixed perfectly, if you're still going to be more than one person on the team, please make sure to leave things better than you found them. Because even if it's the most valuable person on your team is the you 6 months from now, 6 years from now. But if at some point, the ever popular hit by a bus theory, make sure everything is ready so that it can survive you going on. Now, I want to provide 4 tools that I have been using or that I like for the process of document everything. I'll start at the bottom right with Google. It's free, it's available. You can use it to store, if you download your packages, you can store them in there for history. You can download anything, put it into Google Drive. Google Docs is really good at being able to link between documents. On the bottom left, I have ClickUp, which is what we use for our task tracking. They have amazing documentation. Almost everything you can do within Google or other tools, you can link between things. It's amazing for being able to document and keep your SOPs in place. Top right is Notion. Super powerful. Anybody use Notion at all? A couple hands going up. Amazing tool, but it's very much a DIY. You have to build it to make it do exactly what you want to do. The one I ended up using most of the time I was at the company was over at the top left, GitHub. Because as I mentioned, I write a lot of scripts, and I need to be able to keep track of which version did the right thing. So I put everything into GitHub, but I also put a lot of markdown files in there as my journal entries to be able to say, this is what I worked on today, and at the end of every single day, I put down, here's what I was working on, here's what I need to be working on tomorrow. But not all documentation is equal. I found this when I was putting this together. Slides like, hey, this seemed important at the time. A couple hours later, but now it's not. That is not great documentation for checkup. Please do better than me. I felt it important to show my particular wall of shame on what bad documentation can look like. And I'm coming up just in time for this. I wanted to leave you with a little bit of a parting gift, an idea, and see if this spreads. I mentioned that I had all these computers that I didn't know what they were doing, and they were all physically surrounding me. And I had machines that were out there that I had to go and find and bring back to the farm. But once you get 50, 60, 70 computers in your cubicle, how do you keep track of them? So I ended up creating what I call the Mac Rack. It's a bunch of, we had at the company a 3D printer. We had been using aluminum extrusion to remount access points. So I decided to take some leftover parts and a 3D printed file and created 50 slots that could hold all of these computers. And once they went in there, they were each given a tag so that I could be able to identify. But the way when I put them in, I should go to the label, kept all the important information, what version, as I was first gathering them, what version of the OS, what's the model number. Over time, I dropped OS version because no machine went into the rack without being ready to go so that anybody could just walk up, check out the machine from the computer, and hand it over to somebody. And the way I did that was I just put everything. Initially, my first versions of it were using an extension attribute. I love extension attributes. The problem is, if you've got a computer or if one of the people on your team has grabbed a computer and now it needs to be manually taken out of the rack after the fact, there's nothing you can run on the command line to do that. Not easily, but Jamf Recon has the built-in flags from the user and location field of room and position. So I would use Jamf Recon minus room, macrack minus position 33. But I also created a series of Apple shortcuts because I didn't want to spend too much time writing yet more and more scripts. Shortcuts were fast to show the contents of the macrack. Show me everything that has the room of macrack, and to create an HTML page that could be sorted by clicking on the columns. Check in and check out, ask for the ID of the computer, and all of these shortcuts are going to be in my resources, which I will talk about in a second. So you're welcome to play with them, take them apart. Please bear in mind, as I just said, do not rely on handwritten materials. This is all stuff I made, and it's been over a year, so I'm not going to guarantee it still works, but it's a good starting place for you. Speaking of which, I've been threatening to bring this up. I will let you know now. This page is a placeholder. I have been writing this all up in using other note-taking systems. I still need to consolidate it into one place. So what the page you're going to find is a placeholder saying, I will be flogged if this is not updated by the end of day today. So tomorrow morning, if you look at that page and it does not have everything you were looking for, I promise you I'm already in trouble. I have exactly enough time. I wanted to see if there were any questions, concerns, feedback, sarcastic remarks. Please make sure that you get your hands on the microphone. Since we are recording this, we want to make sure that we get the question on there as well. Raise your hand, and there we go.
Thanks for reminding me to breathe and that they hired me to.
My hearing is bad on the best as well. Could you bring the mic closer?
Yeah, thanks for reminding me to breathe. I forget that sometimes. Would you share those 3D printer files?
Yes, they are in that resource file. A bill of materials of where you can links to the bolts, the rails that I purchased, so that you can completely reproduce what I did, including the STL files are all there. I'm glad there's somebody that is interested in that. I wanted my geekery to be loved. Yes.
So my question was regarding your deadhead devices, the ones that are lost in the ether. Mm-hmm. What is your stance on that? Do you mark them with a value saying, hey, they're lost, they're stolen, missing, whatever? Do you remove them from your instance? Kind of what would you, is that contextual maybe?
So I can tell you what we did and what I would have liked to have done. I would have liked to have removed them all. We still had the machines that were all had been scattered around, the ones that even weren't in Jamf. The goal was to go through some place like Diamond Assets or someone to make sure that these machines could be properly disposed of. So I did go through, for all the machines that had been identified as not being going back into the world, if they were never going to be put into anyone's hands again, then yes, they were unmanned. They became unmanaged within Jamf, so they were still in inventory but not being managed. Otherwise, the extension attribute I had that identified the topic ID, I just had smart groups that then kept track of which one was which. Did I answer your question in there? I guess there's follow-up. Good.
Not quite. So were you able to actually find every one of those devices? Is where I'm going toward. What about the ones you cannot get to? What's your experiential things to share regarding that?
So the big trick was, as a function of time, I left out the part that included sitting down with HR and getting a list of every single employee that had come through in that same time frame, and going through and saying, okay, this person's still here, this person's not. So when I'd find 3 computers assigned to the same person and I could see their spread, okay, this is their newest computer, they're no longer using the other 2, decommission the other 2. But there were plenty of computers where they, to this day, are just still in a CSV file with a big red line through them going, I have no idea. So they were marked as, they were unmanaged and marked as such with a I think I had a extension attribute that was just a drop down, active, inactive, or why is this one unknown? And so then it filled it in that way. I hope that gets it. Yeah, it was not fun. That is probably the hardest part of the whole process, is just trying to physically figure out where computers spread across the country have gone, and in a couple of cases out of the country. Anyone else? It's always both reassuring and terrifying when there are no questions. Yes.
I've inherited a large Jamf environment. I'm using Prune. How much do you trust Prune? I'm a little concerned maybe that there's some smart groups or non-smart groups that are tied to things that aren't being shown through Prune.
Sure. That's a really good question. I'm going to be 100% honest with you. Prune is the tool I wish I had used. What I ended up using was a tool of my own design, and what did I already say about that? But no, I trust Prune. I like Prune. The key I would give you for that, back up everything, right? At Rocketman, our process, by the way, is we have, whenever we work with a client, we create a bunch of categories, including quarantine, deprecated, testing. And so anytime we identify something as this is probably no longer in use, so we don't rely as heavily on automated tools like Prune. That was just because I had so much to get through. I had to do it that way, but rather identify the things that are probably ready for deletion. And then if they're still looking like that the next time through, but you're right, smart groups are the big problem. The tool that I had written, such as it is, looked at that. It looked for smart, it even within it had smart groups looking to see if there were other smart groups in it. So it would check for all those particular layers. I'm not sure how accurate it was. And again, I would tend to rely on an industry trusted standard like Prune before trust the guy with the blue hair.
Do you have any recommendations for cleaning up policies and configuration profiles that have individual machines scoped to them? Because the automated tools like Prune, there are active records to those, so they're essentially not flagged by that tool.
Right. So yeah, that was definitely a fun part. Is Okay, I don't have a short answer for you. I will try to give something that is reasonably short based on the clock. The challenge to those is going to be, and I saw you were the person nodding as I was talking about all the things that were scoped to one computer or no computers. Yeah, I couldn't just assume that. First, dig through the logs of those and try to get a general handle on what's been deployed. And whatever that policy is doing, come up with a way, whether it be a smart group or having to bind it to an extension app group, find some way to say what computers have received this policy already and then look at that list and say who should be getting it. For example, in my case, it was often this is scoped to the marketing department and Bob and Alice and Jim and David. Okay, why are they getting it if they're not in, it was supposed to be marketing only, but now it's grown in scope. So look at the logs, look at whatever information you can within inventory as to what received that and say, what was this really meant to do before it became one or two computers? And then either properly scope it to that or delete it and ask forgiveness later. Anyone else? Fantastic. Well, thank you all for staying away through post-lunch nap time kicking in. It's been a pleasure. Have a good day.
Thank you, Chad.